everybody, Matt Barton here with this week's Broker Minute or Two. Hope you had a great Thanksgiving. Now we're back at it, back to work to finish out 2024 strongly. Wanted to cover with you today something that we've seen actually several times in the company, and it's important enough that I wanted to cover this. So we all know we have, we're representing a buyer. We have a buyer-broker agreement that in Section 2.2 calls out how much the company will be paid if a deal is transacted. And then Section 2.2 talks about the potential for the listing brokerage or the seller to meet the obligations contained in 2.1 of this document. So that's pretty straightforward. On the flip side of that coin, we have the ERS, right? And I'm not going to go through all these sections. I'm just going to quickly hit these. Section 2.1, as we've stated before, is how much we get paid if we don't represent anybody else in the transaction. Section 2.2 was added so that if there's an unrepresented buyer, we can put additional compensation there, but that's not what I want to talk about on this one. 2.3 is the section, and the orange portions versus the yellow are the more significant, and then the yellow is kind of the detail underneath. So what does Section 2.3 say? It says, first of all, the company, the listing company, is authorized to what? Offer and communicate compensation up to an amount of X dollars or percent, right, of the gross acquisition price. Then it goes on to say, unless checked below, and it's making reference to this section, right? If this is checked, the seller doesn't authorize the company to enter into any compensation agreements. So if this is not checked, then the rest of this paragraph applies. So unless checked below, the company, meaning the listing company, may enter into a written compensation agreement to pay a buyer's brokerage, not to exceed the amount up here, right? And if the company agrees to that written compensation agreement, then what? Then the seller agrees to take the amount that was entered into a brokerage compensation agreement and add it to the information that is up here in Section 2.1. Okay? So far, pretty straightforward. Okay? Then we have the lovely broker-to-broker compensation agreement, right? And this is where, prior to writing an offer, as a general rule, good practice, we send over an agreement saying, since there is no BAC on the MLS anymore, saying, hey, if we are to do a deal, right? And that's why it uses the term that this is in contemplation of an agreement, right? But basically, if a REPC is signed, then the seller's brokerage, not the seller, agrees to pay the buyer's brokerage a certain amount as contained in this document. And then we can go on and further make detail whether it's gross or net. And oh, by the way, if there is an end date, if we go under contract prior to the end date, which is an important one to pay attention to, then we've already agreed that we'll automatically extend. Now, Section 3 has some clarifying language, and it says, oh, kind of by the way, the amount of compensation that we put in here, right? First of all, it says that, it affirms that the buyer's brokerage does have a buyer-broker agreement. So that's kind of important. Just as a side note, if you didn't have a buyer-broker agreement, you signed this, it potentially means this was a fraudulent document and there's an exit strategy. But let's assume that's not the case here. But what it does say is the buyer's brokerage may not accept compensation from any source, which would include this document, then is greater than what is in the buyer's brokerage buyer-broker agreement. Okay? All right, now to the final event here. Then we have our lovely REPC, and this is the new version that just got updated a couple of weeks ago. And I'm going down to Section 4.4. Used to be 4.3, now it's 4.4, subsection E. And what it says there is, hey, who? The seller and buyer agree that the seller, not the seller's brokerage, shall contribute, and that's a very key thing here. The seller shall contribute X% or a dollar amount to who? Not to the buyer directly, but to the buyer's brokerage. Now for the clarifying verbiage. This payment shall be made in addition to any other compensation agreement. So let's plug in some numbers. Let's assume in the broker-to-broker compensation agreement, you put yeah, you know what, we'll pay 2%, right, to the buyer's brokerage if a deal is transacted. Then we get a REPSI, and in section 4.4E, the buyer's agent puts in, oh, the seller's going to contribute 3% to the buyer's brokerage. Okay, this is where we can potentially really jack it up and create a huge problem, not only for us, but more importantly for our seller. It says, this is the key language, this payment, meaning in this REPSI, in our scenario, 3%, in addition to the 2%, shall be made in addition to any other compensation agreed to by the seller's brokerage to the buyer's brokerage, making indirect reference to the broker-to-broker compensation agreement. And then it goes on and says, buyer agrees that the seller's compensation contribution, which is this document, combined with any other payment from the seller's brokerage, if applicable, to the buyer's brokerage, shall not exceed the amount agreed to between the buyer and the buyer's brokerage in the written buyer broker agreement, not the compensation agreement. So why is this important? If you run across a situation, and I promise you, you will eventually see these materialize, where a buyer's brokerage will put something in their buyer broker agreement that says, hey, we're entitled, let's say they put 6% or 5% or 4.5%. It really doesn't matter. In our scenario that I painted, we have an agreement from the listing brokerage or the seller's brokerage to the buyer's brokerage for 2%. And then we have a REPSI that says the seller is going to contribute to the buyer's brokerage 3%. You add those two together, 2% in the broker-to-broker compensation and 3% in the REPSI. That's a total of 5%, right? And the only restriction on it is, or the only safety net, and this is where a lot of agents are making a huge assumption and putting some false hope in it. They're assuming that the buyer broker says 2.5%, 3%. But I'm telling you, if the buyer's buyer broker agreement says 5%, your seller is, in our scenario here, our hypothetical scenario, they're on the hook for a total of 5%, which I'm pretty sure they did not anticipate, or I'm pretty sure that you didn't do a good job explaining that to them. Otherwise, why would you put them in that situation? So my point is this, the key takeaway is, if you sign a broker-to-broker compensation agreement and you get a REPSI with compensation in it, in most situations, you're going to want to make sure that there's some clarification with the buyer's brokerage. Clarification may be, hey, if we're going to put compensation in the REPSI, then perhaps we should do away or cancel the broker-to-broker compensation agreement, or vice versa, right? Or the third scenario is, before we sign off on this 2% in the broker-to-broker compensation agreement and 3% in the REPSI, I need to see a copy of your buyer broker to make sure we're not exceeding what the seller was expecting to pay. I hope that brings some clarity to this and why we really should pay attention to, buyer broker, ERS, broker-to-broker compensation, and the REPSI. They're all interlinked potentially in this scenario. The reality is, in most situations, it probably won't be a problem. But like I always say, it's never a problem until it's a problem, and then it's usually a significant problem. So pay attention to the details in your documents so that you don't have the wonderful opportunity to deal with the problem that could have been avoided. I hope that helps. Hope you have a great week, and we will talk soon.